There is a chart that every working person should see at least once in their life, and almost nobody ever does. It shows the average real wage growth of American workers by age. And for the first 15 or so years of a career, the line does exactly what you'd hope. It rises, not always steeply, not always smoothly, but consistently upward, reflecting the combination of accumulated experience, expanding skill sets, growing professional networks, and the natural momentum of a career that is still building towards something. And then, somewhere between the late 30s and the early 40s, the line does something that most people never see coming. It flattens. For most workers, real wage growth effectively stops in their early 40s and either plateaus or declines in inflation-adjusted terms for the remainder of their working life. Not because they stop working.
Not because they stop being good at their jobs, but because of a set of structural, psychological, and market forces that operate almost invisibly and that almost nobody prepares for in advance. The people who understand this curve and take specific actions in the decade before the flattening arrives tend to retire comfortably. The people who don't tend to spend the last 20 years of their career on a financial plateau that compounds into a genuinely difficult retirement. My name is Josh, and today we are going through exactly what causes the earnings cliff, why it hits when it does, and the precise actions that the decade between 30 and 40 either sets up or forecloses. Subscribe if that sounds worth your time, and stick around because the actionable part of this video is the most important thing in it. Let me introduce you to the two people whose diverging paths tell this story most clearly. Ryan and Sofia started their careers the same year, same industry, both landing at roughly $58,000. They were equally talented, equally ambitious, equally likely to succeed by any early career measure. At 35, they're both earning about $95,000. The gap between them is negligible. At 50, Ryan earns $103,000. Sofia earns $178,000. At 60, Ryan is still at $104,000 in real terms, his income barely keeping pace with inflation for the past 2 decades. Sofia is at $210,000 and has been for several years, with no sign of flattening. They made roughly the same number of career decisions between 35 and 45. They just made different ones. And the difference between those decisions is the entire difference between those 2 income trajectories for the rest of their income working lives. Here is why the earnings cliff happens when it does. The primary driver of wage growth in the first 15 years of a career is what labor economists call general human capital accumulation. You are becoming better at a broad set of professional skills, building a professional network from scratch, and moving between roles and employers in ways that consistently reset your compensation upward. Job mobility is the single most powerful wage growth tool available to any worker, and it is most available early in a career, when the cost of leaving is low, the options are numerous, and the identity investment in any single employer is relatively shallow. But somewhere around the late 30s, a set of forces begins working against this dynamic simultaneously. First, job mobility decreases. Not because opportunities disappear, but because the cost of moving increases. You have a mortgage, a partner with their own career constraints, children in a school you don't want to disrupt, a seniority position at your current employer that a lateral move would reset. The golden handcuffs, which we've discussed in previous contexts, tighten specifically around mobility in a way that makes every job change feel more expensive and more risky than it did at 28. Second, the external market begins to subtly discount your experience. This is uncomfortable to say and well documented in the research. Hiring managers, most of whom are themselves in their 30s and 40s, show documented age-related hiring preferences that begin to affect candidates in their mid-40s. This is not universal, and it is not insurmountable, but it is real. It is measurable in hiring outcome data, and it means that the job market becomes incrementally less receptive to you as a new hire every year after your mid-40s. Third, and perhaps most importantly, skill obsolescence begins compounding. The skills that made you valuable in your early career are not the same skills that will make you valuable a decade later. industries evolve, technologies change, management paradigms shift, and the worker who spent their 30s deepening expertise in a specific existing skill set rather than deliberately adding adjacent and emerging skills finds themselves increasingly valuable for a narrowing set of roles at the exact moment when job mobility becomes harder and the market becomes less receptive. Sofia understood something at 34 that Ryan didn't understand until it was too late to act on it. She understood that her income trajectory in her 50s was going to be determined almost entirely by decisions she made in her 30s, not decisions she made in her 50s. So she made 3 specific decisions between the ages of 34 and 42 that compounded into the income gap you saw between her and Ryan at 50. The first decision was deliberate skill adjacency. Rather than deepening her expertise in her existing specialty, she spent 2 years systematically adding skills in adjacent areas that she could see were growing in demand. Not a complete pivot, nothing dramatic, but a calculated expansion of her professional surface area that made her relevant to a wider set of roles and a wider set of industries. The second decision was strategic job mobility. At 37, she made a lateral move that looked, on paper, like a step sideways. Same title, marginally better compensation, different company. But the new company was in a faster-growing segment of her industry, had a steeper internal promotion curve, and reset her external market value upward in a way that her previous employer's compensation structure never would have. The third decision was network investment. Not the transactional, card-swapping variety that produces nothing, but deliberate, sustained investment in a small number of genuine professional relationships with people who were 10 to 15 years ahead of her in their careers. Mentors, not in the formal assigned sense, but in the organic sense of people who knew her work, respected it, and were positioned to open doors she couldn't open herself. By the time Sofia was 42, she had a professional network that was actively generating opportunities rather than passively existing. Ryan, who had spent the same period deepening his expertise in his existing role at his existing company, had a deeper skill set in a narrower domain and a professional network that was almost entirely composed of current and former colleagues at 2 employers.
The financial math that makes the timing of all of this so important. The difference between Sofia's income trajectory and Ryan's, starting at age 40 and running through retirement at 65, is not simply the difference in their annual salaries. It is the compounded investment difference that the income gap produces. If Sofia invests the difference between her income and Ryan's every year from 40 to 65 at a 7% return, the investment outcome of that income gap alone exceeds $1.4 million by retirement. The decisions Sofia made between 34 and 42 did not just produce a higher salary, they produced a fundamentally different retirement. And the brutal timing reality of the earnings cliff is that by the time most people realize their income has flattened, the window for the decisions that would have prevented the flattening is already closed. You cannot make the 37-year-old strategic lateral move at 48. The market is less receptive, the personal cost is higher, and the compounding runway is shorter. The decade between 30 and 40 is not just one of 10 equal decades in a working life. It is the decade where the trajectory is set. Everything after follows from it.
So here is the specific framework I want you to leave this video with, because if you are in your 30s right now, this is the most time-sensitive financial information in this entire video. 3 questions. First, is my current role actively expanding my professional surface area, or is it deepening expertise in a narrowing domain? If the honest answer is narrowing, that is worth addressing deliberately and soon. Second, when did I last make a job change that reset my external market value upward? If the answer is more than 3 years ago, the market's perception of your compensation may have drifted significantly below what a move would produce. Third, do I have genuine professional relationships with people who are 10 or more years ahead of me in a career trajectory I find compelling? If the answer is no, that network does not exist yet, and it takes years to build. None of these questions have easy or immediate answers, but the people who ask them at 35 and act on the answers have a dramatically different income trajectory at 50 than the people who ask them at 48 and discover the window has narrowed. Sofia didn't have better luck than Ryan. She had better questions, asked earlier.